Phil, the New York badass Baroni, was once a fan favorite. Explosive knockouts, wild cage jumps, and a personality as loud as his punches. But today, at 49, his story is no longer about victories. It's about tragedy. Baroni sits behind bars in Mexico, accused of aggravated femicide, facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. How did a fighter who once lit up the UFC and PRIDE end up here? In this video, we'll uncover the rise, the downfall, and the dark truth about Baroni's life that few ever saw coming. Phil Baroni's story begins far from the lights of Las Vegas or the roaring crowds of Tokyo. Born in Long Island, New York in 1976, Baroni grew up in a tough, blue-collar environment where competition was survival. Wrestling became his first escape. At Nassau Community College, he made his mark as a two-time All-American before transferring to Hofstra University and later Central Michigan. He had the raw athleticism and intensity that drew attention. But what really set Baroni apart was his personality, cocky, brash, and unapologetically loud. Even in amateur wrestling rooms, he was larger than life. When MMA began exploding in the late 1990s, Baroni knew he had found his arena. With his wrestling base and boxing power, he transitioned into mixed martial arts with ferocity. By the early 2000s, he was already turning heads with devastating knockout power. His UFC debut in 2001 came against Curtis Stout, where his crisp boxing and relentless pressure earned him a unanimous decision win. But it was his fight against former champion Dave Mena that put him on the map. In just 18 seconds, Baroni unleashed a barrage of punches that knocked Mena out cold. Leaping onto the cage, he declared himself the best Eva, cementing his reputation as the UFC's ultimate showman. From there, his fame skyrocketed. Baroni fought in PRIDE fighting championships, one of the most prestigious organizations in the world, where his charisma and knockout ability made him a fan favorite in Japan. He picked up memorable wins against Ikuhisa Minowa, Ryo Chonan, and Yuki Kondo, proving he wasn't just hype, he could deliver. The Japanese crowds adored his wild entrances, his flamboyant bravado, and the way he carried himself like a rock star. Even when he lost with spectacle, but beneath the flash, cracks were forming. His record was becoming inconsistent. He was talented but reckless, sometimes refusing to game plan or train properly, believing his fists alone would solve every problem. Still, during this stretch, Baroni became one of the most recognizable faces in MMA's wild boom era. He had the nickname, the power, the swagger, and for a time, it seemed like nothing could stop the New York badass. For a brief window in the mid-2000s, Phil Baroni lived like a superstar. Known for his chiseled physique, his movie star looks, and his aggressive fighting style, he was one of the sport's earliest crossovers into mainstream attention. He appeared on television shows, dabbled in professional wrestling, and became a go-to personality for promotions looking to hype events. Fans either loved him or hated him, but they couldn't look away. Yet while the persona of the New York badass grew, his performances in the cage told a different story. After his UFC highlight reel knockouts, Baroni began piling up losses. He lost rematches to top contenders like Matt Lindland, suffered setbacks against Evan Tanner, and slowly developed a reputation as an exciting fighter who couldn't string together wins when it mattered most. His record hovered close to .500, and as the sport evolved, Baroni's one-dimensional reliance on boxing left him exposed against more well-rounded opponents. His decline wasn't just about skills, it was about discipline. Reports circulated that Baroni's training camps were inconsistent. He'd often get into confrontations with teammates, overwork himself with weights instead of focusing on technical improvement, or party harder than he should have between fights. A positive steroid test in 2007 after his Strikeforce fight against Frank Shamrock earned him a 6-month suspension, further damaging his reputation. To some fans, Baroni became a cautionary tale, a fighter who had all the tools and charisma to be great but lacked the discipline to maximize it. Still, he refused to fade quietly. Baroni bounced around promotions: Elite XC, Strikeforce, PRIDE, DREAM, Bellator, ONEFC, anywhere that would give him a shot. His willingness to fight anyone, anywhere, kept him employed, but it also accelerated his decline. Losses piled up, his body took punishment, and the bright lights that once loved him grew dim. Outside the cage, Baroni was often brash, argumentative, and outspoken. He defended controversial figures like War Machine, whose own criminal record shocked the MMA world. It painted a picture of a man spiraling, clinging to his badass persona, even as his fighting career collapsed. By the 2000s, Baroni's best days were behind him. He had transformed from a feared knockout artist to a journeyman known more for his antics than his achievements. And while he still carried himself with swagger, the gap between Phil Baroni the performer and Phil Baroni the fighter was becoming painfully clear. On January 1st, 2023, the story of Phil, the New York badass Baroni, took a turn darker than anyone could have imagined. Mexican authorities announced they had arrested Baroni in the town of San Pancho, Nayarit, after a disturbing incident involving his girlfriend. According to reports, Baroni called police to his hotel room claiming she had slipped and fallen in the shower. But what investigators found told a very different story. His girlfriend was discovered dead, covered in bruises and injuries, more than 37 in total, scattered across her face, arms, and body. The explanation of an accidental fall quickly unraveled. Baroni was immediately detained and questioned, his story filled with contradictions. Witnesses told police they had heard shouting coming from the room earlier that evening, and neighbors claimed Baroni had a volatile temper, often raising his voice and arguing in public. Prosecutors pieced together a chilling case. This was not an accident, but a violent assault that had escalated fatally. Within days, Baroni was formally charged with aggravated femicide, one of the most severe charges under Mexican law. For MMA fans who had grown up watching Baroni strut to the cage with bravado, the news was devastating. It wasn't just another former fighter getting into trouble. It was a man accused of the unthinkable, murdering the woman he was supposed to love. Headlines from ESPN, CBS, and ABC News spread the story worldwide, shocking even those who had stopped following his career years earlier. Baroni wasn't in the news for a comeback or a guest appearance. He was now a criminal defendant in a foreign country, his face plastered on police reports instead of fight posters. Baroni was transferred to the Venustiano Carranza State Prison in Tepic, Nayarit, awaiting trial. With Mexican femicide laws carrying penalties of 30 to 75 years in prison, the 46-year-old fighter's life was effectively over. The man who once celebrated in Tokyo arenas, screaming to crowds of thousands, now sat in a cramped, dimly lit cell. For many fans, the contrast was jarring. How did the New York badass, once known for swagger and charisma, become another tragic headline of violence and downfall? The MMA community's reaction was immediate and conflicted. Some fighters, stunned by the charges, remembered Baroni as a friend, a teammate, and a man who had once given his all inside the cage. Others could only express horror and disgust. For a sport already fighting its reputation for violence and troubled athletes outside the ring, Baroni's arrest was another blow to MMA's image. Josh Barnett, who had shared locker rooms with Baroni in Japan, described the news as terrible and incredibly tragic. Journalists like Ariel Helwani covered the story soberly, emphasizing the gravity of the allegations and reminding fans that this was no longer about sports. It was about a woman's life lost. Fans on social media expressed disbelief, with some clinging to the hope that the reports were exaggerated, while others accepted the grim reality. In Mexico, the case became part of a much larger conversation. Femicide is a national crisis, with thousands of women killed every year and very few cases resulting in justice. Activist groups in Nayarit highlighted the incident as yet another reminder of the dangers women face, regardless of their partner's fame. They demanded a swift and severe sentence, making it clear that Baroni's celebrity status would not shield him from accountability. Back in the United States, the story reignited debates about the dark side of combat sports. Fighters endure years of head trauma, substance abuse, and emotional instability. Could brain damage or CTE have played a role in Baroni's violent spiral? Or was this simply the inevitable outcome of years of unchecked behavior, arrogance, and declining self-control? The debate tore through online forums, podcasts, and MMA columns. What was undeniable was the tragedy. A woman had lost her life, her family left grieving, and Phil Baroni, once known as the Best Eva, was now known for something far darker. The MMA community mourned not just the victim of this crime, but the loss of what Baroni could have been. For fans who once idolized him, the reality was hard to swallow. The New York badass had become a symbol of wasted talent, self-destruction, and unforgivable violence. When Phil Baroni was transferred to the Venustiano Carranza State Prison in Tepic, Mexico, the contrast from his former life could not have been more stark. The man who once strutted into arenas with sunglasses and bravado now wore a prison uniform, his future hanging in the balance. Images and short video clips that leaked online showed a tired, weathered Baroni, older, softer, his trademark intensity gone. To many, he looked unrecognizable. The once chiseled physique that symbolized the New York badass had given way to the fragility of a man broken down by years of fighting, hard living, and now incarceration. Prison life in Mexico is notoriously harsh. Reports describe overcrowded cells, limited resources, and dangerous conditions where violence can erupt at any time. Baroni, once celebrated in Tokyo's Pride Ring and Las Vegas's UFC Octagon, now faced an entirely different kind of fight, one for survival. Sources close to the case suggested he struggled to adapt, going from a man adored by fans to one despised for the crime he allegedly committed. For someone who thrived on attention, the silence of prison life must have been deafening. Gone were the cameras, the microphones, the chants of New York badass. Now, his only audience was guards and fellow inmates, many of whom likely had no idea of his past stardom. Those who did know weren't impressed. To them, he wasn't a fighter, but an accused killer. Friends who spoke out after his arrest described Baroni as a shell of the man they once knew. Some mentioned his decline had been obvious for years. Erratic behavior, constant partying, inconsistent training, and a seeming inability to cope with the reality that his fight career had ended. For years, MMA promotions had given him chances even when he no longer belonged at the elite level. Now, there would be no second chances. His legacy was stained forever. In prison, Baroni's story became less about what he accomplished and more about what he destroyed. At 49, he was no longer a fighter, no longer a commentator, not even a trainer. He was just another inmate awaiting trial for one of the most serious charges in Mexico. His cage was no longer a place of glory. It was a cell, locked tight, with no crowd to cheer for him when the door slammed shut. As news of Baroni's arrest and charges spread, the MMA community was torn between heartbreak and anger. This was not the first time a fighter's name had been connected to violence outside the cage, but Baroni's case felt heavier. It wasn't a bar fight, a DUI, or a domestic dispute. He was accused of femicide, a crime that carried not just legal weight but profound social outrage, especially in Mexico, where violence against women has reached epidemic levels. Former opponents and teammates shared mixed reactions. Some remembered Baroni fondly as a charismatic teammate who lit up training rooms with his energy and trash talk. Others acknowledged his volatility, admitting they weren't surprised to hear he had finally crossed a line. Josh Barnett, who had fought alongside Baroni in Japan, said it was tragic all around, recognizing both the victim's loss and Baroni's wasted life. Journalists and analysts were less forgiving, noting how Baroni's decline had been in plain sight for years, and that the MMA world too often overlooked warning signs when promoting troubled fighters. Fans on social media were equally divided. Some clung to disbelief, insisting there had to be more to the story, that maybe Baroni wasn't capable of such violence. But, as details emerged, injuries inconsistent with his story, neighbors reporting heated arguments, those defenses grew harder to justify. Many longtime fans, once captivated by his knockouts and brash persona, admitted their memories of cheering him on now felt tainted. The arrest also sparked conversations about fighter health and accountability. accountability. Did years of brain trauma and concussions contribute to Baroni's behavior? Could untreated CTE, depression, or substance abuse have played a role? Or was this simply a violent man finally stripped of excuses? Podcasts and columns debated the issue, but no consensus emerged. What everyone agreed on was that the sport had lost another name to darkness. For a generation of fans, Phil Baroni represented MMA's wild, unpredictable era, a time when fighters lived hard both inside and outside the cage. But now, those same fans were forced to reckon with the ugly truth. The New York Badass had become a headline for all the wrong reasons, and no matter the outcome of his trial, his legacy in MMA was permanently stained. As Phil Baroni sat in prison awaiting trial, one of the most haunting aspects of his story was his silence. A man who had once thrived on microphones and cameras was suddenly reduced to whispers, with no direct statements made to the public. For years, Baroni had been outspoken, brash, and larger than life. Now, all fans saw were mugshots and court reports. To those who remembered his screaming post-fight interviews in PRIDE or his bold declarations in the UFC, the silence felt chilling. But beyond the courtroom headlines, another truth was visible: Baroni's physical decline. Once known for his sculpted body and intimidating physique, reports from his later years showed a man who had aged rapidly. His training had all but stopped, and with no spotlight to keep him disciplined, his body lost the definition that once symbolized his identity as the New York Badass. Photographs from his final appearances at independent wrestling shows or boxing exhibitions revealed a man bloated, slower, and visibly older than his years. By the time of his arrest, at age 46, he looked like a shadow of the athlete who once dazzled crowds in Tokyo and Las Vegas. There were also whispers of deeper health issues. Years of head trauma, countless wars in the cage, and brutal sparring sessions had undoubtedly taken their toll. Former training partners suggested Baroni displayed mood swings, memory lapses, and signs of neurological damage, symptoms often associated with CTE. In interviews before his arrest, Baroni sometimes rambled, appeared distracted, or spoke with bitterness about how the fight world had forgotten him. For fans who once viewed him as a symbol of energy and swagger, seeing him stumble through later appearances was heartbreaking. All of this combined, silence, physical decline, and possible neurological struggles, painted a picture of a man whose identity had been stripped away. Without fighting, Baroni had no anchor, no purpose. The cage had once defined him, but outside of it, he was lost. And tragically, instead of reinventing himself like other retired fighters, Baroni spiraled into violence and destruction. His decline wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, a steady unraveling that ultimately ended in tragedy for himself and those closest to him. When fans look back on Phil Baroni today, the story is no longer about his explosive knockouts or his brash charisma. Instead, it's about a man whose legacy was destroyed by his final acts. Every fighter hopes to be remembered for their victories, their highlight reels, or their championship moments. Baroni, however, will now forever be remembered for a mugshot and a courtroom. In the MMA community, his fall has become a cautionary tale. He was one of the sport's earliest stars to embrace showmanship, paving the way for future fighters who used charisma to boost their profile. Yet, unlike those who balanced entertainment with discipline, Baroni lost himself in his own persona. His career ended with more losses than wins, and now his life outside the cage is defined by an alleged act of unforgivable violence. The damage to his reputation is permanent. MMA media, once eager to celebrate his highlight knockouts, now treat his name with hesitation. Fans who once wore New York Badass shirts now feel shame at even mentioning him. For younger fans who never saw his prime, Baroni isn't remembered as a pioneer. He's remembered as a disgraced fighter facing a lifetime in prison. The YouTube highlight reels of his wild PRIDE fights can't erase the headlines of femicide. Even his own peers, many of whom once respected his toughness, have distanced themselves. Few have spoken publicly in his defense, and those who have usually frame it as sympathy for his possible brain damage rather than excuses for his behavior. Fighters like Josh Barnett and others have acknowledged the tragedy not just for Baroni, but for his victim. emphasizing that no amount of concussions or personal demons can excuse what happened. For the sport, the Baroni case underscores the darkest truth about MMA's wild early years. Many of its stars fought for little money, endured massive damage, and were left with nothing once the lights faded. Some adapted, becoming coaches, commentators, or business people. Baroni, tragically, could not. His legacy, once colorful and chaotic, is now stained permanently. What was once a career remembered for knockouts and swagger has become a story of decline, disgrace, and darkness. Phil Baroni's story doesn't end with his fists raised in victory, but with silence in a foreign prison cell. At 49 years old, the man once known as the New York Badass is now remembered less for his knockouts and swagger, and more for a crime that destroyed his life and shattered his legacy. Even if he were somehow released, the stain of his actions and the life lost cannot be erased. What makes Baroni's downfall so haunting is that it feels inevitable in hindsight. He was always chasing the spotlight, always burning the candle at both ends, always living recklessly. When the fights stopped, he had nothing left to ground him. Years of punishment, untreated trauma, and unchecked behavior created a storm that finally consumed him. For fans, his story is more than one man's tragedy. It's a warning. It shows how fame without discipline and glory without balance can turn into ruin. Today, Baroni sits as a cautionary tale of MMA's wild era. A man who once shouted he was the best Eva now faces spending the rest of his life behind bars, his name forever linked not to greatness but to tragedy. His rise was fast, his fall even faster, and his final chapter may be written not in the cage but in the cold walls of a prison.